If you'd like to join me, let's begin with a bow. Hello, my name is Uri Talmor, and I am one of the professors at Naropa University in the mindfulness-based transpersonal program teaching Gestalt awareness in the Gestalt experiment. Gestalt awareness is the first semester class. Gestalt experiment is the second semester class. Speak a little bit to those subtitles for the class. The first semester is more about orienting to what is Gestalt psychotherapy, what I've started to call transpersonal Gestalt psychotherapy. And the second semester gives some more opportunities for you all to directly experiment with using the modality. So that said, this first lecture, I'm going to mainly focus on some basic concepts. We'll continue that in another lecture for the second class. First two classes are really structured to get you oriented to the main principles. And I'll start by discussing what is transpersonal Gestalt, and baked into that is what is Gestalt psychotherapy. And over the years, over the decades, I feel like Gestalt psychotherapy has been taught and developed into being taught in a significantly unique way here in our transpersonal program. So that said, let me move over to this outline. This is what we'll start with. Go through this. It's quite a bit of information. So the nice part about this is new, it's 2001, whenever you might be watching this, but 2001, I decided to record the lectures so that the course time we have together can be more focused on experiential activities. So the plan is we've got some videos at this point that I'm recording. We have some that you maybe have already watched for the first class that Deb Bowman recorded, that Robin Chavain has recorded, some of them they recorded together. And the intention is to have all the didactic material recorded, and again, freeing up the class for more experiential activities. So let me begin by explaining the different colors here. So you see a lot of red, here's some blue. Dewey Freeman and Deb Bowman are two professors we had for decades. Deb Bowman actually brought our program over from another institute. I think it was called the Boulder, I think just the Boulder Institute. They had a transpersonal counseling program. Naropa bought it out. Deb came with the school and was heavily involved for a period of time, was dean of the whole graduate department, but really held the Gestalt course. And Dewey was her Gestalt trainer and also taught in the department for decades. You may see them teaching courses here and there, but they effectively are at this point retired. Dewey, I did not have as my Gestalt instructor. I actually graduated from this program in 2004. But I took Dewey for every class I could. He's absolutely brilliant. We'll get into some of his work around development, around attachment. He's woven that into the kind of Gestalt we now teach at Naropa. And then Deb Bowman, also absolutely brilliant clinician. Even though I didn't get to take either of their courses for the Gestalt course you're now taking, my instructor was another brilliant psychotherapist, Victoria Story, and the fourth Gestalt instructor at the time when I was in the program, Dwayne Molnar. All four of these folks were considered master therapists in the area. They still are, obviously. I think Victoria is in California now. But Dwayne is still around. Dewey and Deb still around and practicing as I record this in August of 2021. And so all that said, I 4-ish years ago decided to meet with Dewey. He has these supervision groups, and the intention was to learn how to teach this class better. I think I've been teaching this class for 5 or 6 years now, but just wanted to better teach the class, but also try to gather and preserve his brilliance. Because if you've ever had the chance to meet with him or Deb, they are, I consider them master therapists. And just watching them work, even just being in their presence, there's a lot that's being taught and transmitted. So wanted to learn as much as I could from him, try to preserve what he brought to this class, and met with him for about 2 years, took extensive notes, and you'll see his voice here and in the following videos. If I keep this format, it'll be in red. And after meeting with him for a couple of years, decided to start meeting with Deb Bowman because I didn't have a chance to learn from her either. Found her to be just as brilliant. It is just a different perspective in some ways from Dewey's, and you'll see her voice here and there in the blue. And so I actually have 3 years worth of notes that I've organized into the themes of this class, and we'll be drawing on those as we navigate through this course. So for our purposes, this video, just wanting to orient you a little bit to Gestalt and some of the basic concepts. Let's talk about so transpersonal Gestalt. So the first section here is going to basically be what is Gestalt psychotherapy, and afterwards I'll go a little bit into more detail around what might be some transpersonal elements that are a little unique to Dewey and Deb and how this is taught here at Naropa. So Dewey Freeman, has he defined Gestalt? The process of exploring our experience in and of relationship while in relationship, holding I, thou with the utmost respect, working to support growth in relationship, deepening contact, and inspiring creative choice are tenets of this therapy. So there's a lot baked into this. I, thou, we're going to get into more later for the second class, but for now, I, thou, as opposed to I, it. Seeing the other person as a fellow human being, as a subject, not an object. If you're going to draw on those philosophy terms that are common in philosophy, especially when you're studying the psychology of self and how we relate to the world. And so for Dewey, the core of Gestalt is it's almost a meditation, a relational meditation practice where you're exploring how you experience relationship with yourself, with the other, while being in relationship. It's nothing about Gestalt as a philosophical endeavor, and we'll be touching on that here and there. So here we've got 4, and there were different lists as we met. He would go over, here's what I think Gestalt is, here. So the kind of different versions of the same thing, all pointing in the same direction. But this, again, very reflective of how Dewey works with people using Gestalt. He is very big on contact. And you'll see that as we move through this course. There's I think it's class 4 and 5. We're going to talk about contact boundary disturbances. So Fritz Perls, Laura Perls, they were so interested in relationship, not to jump too far ahead, but they were psychoanalysts. And in the beginning, Perls didn't mean to start a new form of psychotherapy. He was simply trying to advance psychoanalysis. And Laura Perls, we'll get to this a little bit later, but was one of the first psychoanalysts to actually sit in front of the client in the spirit of being more in relationship. So as they're working with folks, really curious about the contact, they noticed that there were specific defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms are a pretty core part of psychoanalysis. There are about 5 or 6 that they recognized were very consistently present where contact was disrupted. So we're going to get to that later. There's 5 or 6, depending on who you talk to. But for our purposes at this point, this is where their focus was. Contact, i.e. the relationship. It's not just the main intervention. How is this person making contact with themselves, with others, with quote unquote reality? We'll get more what that might mean. But it's also the container that you're working from. So contact relationship. This is very much Dewey, but not just Dewey. We'll get more to it in a future class, but attachment and development. What happens over time? How do we develop? Different types of trauma. Now people are talking more about complex trauma, thank goodness. Basically trauma over time. And the definitions I've looked at, they do talk about sometimes with somebody who is close to you. I would argue, not argue, but I would weave into that somebody you trust. When there's a trusting relationship, those traumas are different than traumas with people you don't know or maybe don't trust. So attachment development, well, it's a whole class on that we're going to get to. Systemic perspective, Gestalt by default is about the whole field. It's a systemic lens. I say by default. Gestalt, the term came from Gestalt psychology, and they were really exploring perception. How do we perceive the world? How do we see parts of the whole? Do we see the whole? What's in the foreground, background? When we don't have all the pieces, do we just fill in the gaps via our attitudes, perceptions, beliefs, histories? They were very interested in that, how we perceive the world. And Gestalt is about the whole. So by default, a systemic perspective, we'll get more into that when we talk about fields. And then last one, again, this is more Dewey's flavor, but very consistent in how he works. He's looking at energy. I would argue that is connected to the transpersonal. That brings us into a transpersonal lens. We'll get more into that later. I will say at this point, or should I save it? Let me just make a note so we can touch on it. Transpersonal, non-dual versus theistic relational. If you've taken transpersonal psychology, I think you have. I think that you had that last semester in the spring first year. But hopefully you have that frame. If not, we'll review it briefly and give you a bit of a context. Because of course you're going to work with people who are not transpersonal, not spiritual, who won't maybe believe in energy. That's fine. We're going to talk about how to relate to that. Okay. So again, different ways of talking about just the core principles. You'll hear this kind of piece a lot, sounding like this. Like Gestalt is awareness, responsibility, and we've touched on relationship. Just giving you different flavors of how this work gets summarized. Just about, I would argue, anyone you read, they're going to be a good agreement around awareness, self-responsibility, and of course the relationship piece. So, and self-responsibility, we'll get more into that. I believe it's the second class. So since Gestalt is about relationship, there is no pathology. All human behaviors are an attempt and movement towards health. We're going to touch on that more when we get to holism, but this is huge. And obviously, well, maybe not so obviously in this point of your professional development, but somewhat counterculture to very counterculture to the mainstream counseling field, where the focus is on pathology, on diagnosing. That comes from the culture of Western medicine, allopathic medicine, where we're looking at diseases. Gestalt psychotherapy is why, in some ways, this class is such a good fit for our program, the transpersonal program. It's holistic. It doesn't buy into that. It sees that people have adapted, arguably simply developed in these ways. And if they can get the right kind of support, then they can continue to develop, heal, but no one's broken. And again, we'll get more into this as we get into holism. Another quality of Gestalt is that it's more than just a therapy technique. Some people view it as a philosophy, as a broader lens. Others, especially in the authentic relating community, if you're familiar with them, and we're going to dive into that pretty deeply later in the semester, it can be seen as a relational meditation practice, a continual practice of staying aware, staying in relationship, noticing what actually is happening, self-regulating. Don't want to jump too far ahead, but it's more than just a technique. And actually, some Gestalt psychotherapists would very strongly say it's not a technique. It's a way of being. It's clearly a way of perceiving. And from that, there's a way to intervene that is a lot more creative and open and flexible. And again, we'll get more into that too. Touched on this already. Gestalt means whole, and our perception is what gives us meaning. So again, they were looking at perception in Gestalt psychology, which is one of the foundations for Gestalt psychotherapy. And you've maybe heard this: the whole is greater than the sum of its individual parts. A simple example would be the organs in your body. Maybe a bit of a graphic example, but if we separate those, you look at your organs separately, and let's not even talk about if you dissected a body, but just kept it whole, but just looked at each organ, brilliant, amazing, fascinating expressions of nature. And when you look at the whole of the human body and what comes out of that, you can't say that that is simply the sum of these individual organs. There's something even more that gets created. Continuing on, I mentioned attachment. So let's define it a little bit. We've all read Dewey's Voice. Attachment is a process of learning to be in relationship and trusting. When we go through things with another and come out of it, when this happens enough and becomes predictable, then we attach and deepen intimacy. Dewey also talks a lot about trust. How do we build trust? And basically that over time, he would say something funny in his classes, that a relationship doesn't even begin in his mind. This is one way of putting it, but a relationship doesn't begin in some ways until there's a conflict. How many times have you had a conflict with someone? You thought, you were very close, but then the conflict happens and you never talk to them again. He would argue that wasn't much of a relationship. You only know you have a relationship, per Dewey's definition, after you've been able to resolve a rupture. And what he would say is that when you string those along, a rupture and another repair, another rupture, another repair, that over time that creates trust and that creates intimacy over time. So for him, attachment is getting through the hard stuff and making it out okay. Interesting definition of attachment. Obviously, there are other ways of looking at attachment, but for our purposes with Gestalt, it's a helpful one, I think. Okay, moving right along. So getting more into the practice of Gestalt, Dewey talks about our main job, given how relationally focused we are, how much we're looking at where people are making contact, disrupting contact. The one way of putting it is our job is to create an opening and then be available for contact. If you think about it, we'll get to this more later, but Gestalt we talk a lot about creating experiments. And so you can see, I'm going to go more into that. You can see down here, homeostasis disruption. But we're setting up experiments to support people in their growth. I'll leave it at that for now. And you can see how for many people, simply being present and available for relationship might feel like an experiment for them. More on that as we continue. So more Dewey's words, my job is to create an opening and leave that opening open so you can step into it. And when you do, I'll be available for contact. And Pearls brought in the idea of contact. Pearls and Laura and Fritz Pearls. And so as therapists, like we're starting to touch on, is we're really looking at and exploring how are people making contact or not making contact with, again, quote unquote, reality, the reality of their own experience, the reality of being in a relationship with another person, primarily you, especially if you're doing one-on-one individual therapy. Keep going. Gestalt definition again. So okay, so this is getting back to Dewey's definition. We're repeating it. Exploration of our experiences in and of relationship while in relationship, while in contact. Are you in contact with self and with another being? Everything is about contact. This is Dewey's voice. He is very, very big on contact. We're going to go into some other layers or ways of looking at, let's just call it contact, relationship. There's obviously more to it than that. And this was interesting from talking to Deb about Dewey's take. She had an interesting point that it's possible one of the reasons that Dewey is so focused on contact is because that's what a lot of people on average struggle with. And what Deb brings in more explicitly than Dewey does, I don't think he would disagree with any of this, but he doesn't make it as explicit or focus on it as much. But Deb's point, Deb adds that in order to be in a relationship, you also need to be able to withdraw. If it's only about contact, which Dewey doesn't say that per se, but if the focus is only contact, that's not really a relationship. In relationship, obviously has to be by choice, freedom, and you need to be able to withdraw. Sometimes we might feel like we have to withdraw in order to then be able to come back and make contact. But withdraw, for most people on average, they can do that pretty well. A lot of different ways to withdraw. Also, that can be, not sustainable. Addictions is a type of withdrawal. Obviously, dissociation is getting more attention in our field. All ways of arguably regulating, but also withdrawal. And so making contact can bring out quite a bit. So again, Dewey's voice, obviously there's more to it. You're going to get several different perspectives around this. Okay, so moving right along. I'm just checking the time here. Okay, so homeostasis disruption. Homeostasis disruption, create an experiment to create an experience that will disturb someone's homeostasis of not making contact while maintaining contact with them. So this is the experiment oftentimes. And again, back to the earlier point, simply being available for relationship can really disrupt someone's homeostasis. can be an experiment in and of itself. But we're going to get into more explicit ways of doing that. Just know that being available for contact is the foundation. But this is a beautiful way of talking about experiments. You hear a lot about experiments in Gestalt. They're constantly running experiments, offering experiments. Really, it's another way of saying intervention, experiential. But I love this. People come in, they have their ways of being, and you're seeing where they maybe could make a little bit more contact with their experience, with reality, with the reality of the relationship. And so you're going to disrupt how they keep that homeostasis of not making contact. Okay. Another core concept, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. Let me just go ahead and read this. Another focus is completing unfinished business, which we'll talk more about during the trauma class. I think that's class 10, but also during the developmental class. There's development that can be left unfinished. And Dewey has its own way of talking about it in terms of holes in our development that are basically holes of where needs didn't get met. And we'll get more into that later. And of course, trauma and development can be intimately connected, as we see with what we now call complex trauma. Mainly when you look at the definitions of complex trauma, they're describing trauma over time or repeated trauma. They do talk about it can involve people we are close to. I would nuance that the key is the trust. Even if it's a one-time trauma. So imagine this. You're riding your bike through a neighborhood as a child, and all of a sudden out of the bushes, the neighborhood bully or someone you don't know comes out and pushes you off the bike. Sit for a moment, how does that impact you? And then as best you can, erase that. Next day, back on your bike, riding through the neighborhood, and one of your caregivers jumps out of the bushes and pushes you off your bike. And just notice the difference between the two. When we are betrayed or hurt, which is a betrayal by somebody we think we can trust, our body has learned or thinks it can trust, it's a whole different type of trauma. I think it's one of the keys of complex trauma. It's not just about the repetition. So all that said, a major focus in this modality in Gestalt psychotherapy is helping people complete the unfinished business. And so if you're weaving that into, not being in touch with reality, you can look at what Dan Siegel calls implicit memories versus explicit memories, where the explicit memory is what you remember tangibly. There's a time, there's a date, and then you can connect some of the feelings and sensations. But oftentimes, because we are so good at dissociating, we push things away, we forget, maybe we just completely checked out while something was happening that was overwhelming, painful, traumatic. We don't have any explicit memory. What happened, any like a visual memory of what we saw, what we experienced, but stored in our body. If we don't remember the actual event, our bodies will still hold the implicit memory, what we felt and what sensations were there. And the way that shows up is oftentimes when people show up and they'll tell us, yeah, I just have a lot of anxiety and I'm not sure why. It's just, I'm an anxious person. As we slow them down, get them more in touch and make contact with their anxiety, and there's obviously some nuanced ways of doing this, but generally speaking, if they can stay with it while being at least neutral, not judging it, not having any stories about it, they'll start to uncover potentially some of the explicit events, the explicit memories that the anxiety came from. So sometimes the unfinished business is simply the emotional energy that people carry, the uncomfortable emotional energy people carry And we're going to learn, you're going to see me demo it in the class, or whatever section you're in. You're going to see in your instructor demonstrate how to safely explore that, so that we can be with those parts of ourselves. We can explore those memories in ways that bring it completion. So unfinished business, common way we talk about basically unresolved trauma. Okay. Moving right along, this is from Deb. It's easier to teach CBT/DBT than teaching presence, spontaneity, creativity, courage, talent. Students get that from reading a book, can get that from reading a book. It's a foundation for that work. If you have the foundation of presence, then it's easier to incorporate DBT skills. People don't gain presence unless they learn it experientially, i.e., actually practice it. So related to that, now I'll flesh this out a little bit more, Dewey would talk about how you can get good at Gestalt, and then you will be good at other models like CBT, DBT, acceptance and commitment therapy, internal family systems. And if you're not familiar with these terms, cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and then people will talk about how these evolved into acceptance and commitment therapy. But add really any of the somatic approaches. The reason this is true is because Gestalt is the foundation. It's more creative, more open-ended. But what Dewey says is that if you get really good, let's say, at internal family systems, you're not going to necessarily be good at doing Gestalt psychotherapy. And this is because these models are basically collections of experiments. These people who develop these models, ACT is a notable exception in some ways, but it still has its own pattern, and you do this and then this and then this. IFS especially is you do these experiments with parts, and then these experiments with parts, and then these, and then these. What these practitioners saw that over time, there was a pattern of experiments that were helpful, and then they would create models like Hakomi, sensory motor integration, that basically taught these experiments as techniques. And, and then that becomes the training, where with Gestalt, you learn more the foundation and the practice of how to simply be present, how to actually make contact with people, what that looks like, how to explore that, and then how to create any experiment you want based on where the person's at, your clinical conceptualization of what might be helpful. And so you get the foundation and you get some confidence in just making up any experiment that might be helpful. And that can then be, those skills can transfer to any other modality. And I speak from personal experience. I obviously, like I mentioned, took this class, a Gestalt class, in 2002, 2003. And then in my internship, Stu Brown, my supervisor, strongly recommended that I learn internal family systems. And so he brought in Richard Schwartz. He did a 3-day workshop. And most people, IFS, for a lot of people, most people, is a fairly complex approach to facilitate. And I was able to start doing IFS after the 3-day workshop fairly seamlessly, and kind of never looked back. I did the first year training with Stu later that year after I graduated. But it was interesting watching other people, relatively speaking, struggle with learning IFS. And my understanding, looking back on it and teaching this class many times, and then hearing Dewey talk about this, I now understand why. Because I got this as a foundation. I got Gestalt psychotherapy as a foundation. And then IFS, relatively speaking, was a piece of cake. So very excited to share this with you all at this stage of your professional development. All right, so let us keep going. Psychoanalysis and Gestalt. So just to give you a little bit of comparing and contrast, like I mentioned earlier, and psychoanalysis is no exception. This is the mainstream of the field. It's all disorder. Where Gestalt is looking at how do you promote contact or inhibit contact. Psychoanalysis, you should be a blank slate for the client to allow for transference, relatively speaking, and psychoanalysis now is a somewhat diverse modality in and of itself. And that's still a core piece, is letting the clients bring whatever they have, the transference, so they can transfer these unresolved, maybe hurt, wound associated relationships to the analyst so that then it can get integrated, ideally integrated. Laura Pearls, like I mentioned, was the first person to sit in front of a client. Gestalt was one of the first somatic-based therapies, as well as one of the first experiential therapies. And Dewey argues that all the other somatic approaches, they came from Gestalt, that people had some either direct or kind of second, what would be the term? Direct or like second generation influence from Gestalt. For example, Hakomi, Ron Kurtz, the developer of Hakomi, got out of grad school and ran Gestalt groups with Stella Resnick. You're going to read one of her articles later. Did that for 2 years and then started, Hakomi. And one quick side note about Hakomi, in talking to Cedar Barstow, local, again, master therapist who created Right Use of Power, she and Deb Bowman, they both talked to me about how there was quite a cross-pollination between Gestalt and Hakomi especially, and even Hakomi and IFS, which is another discussion. But as you've maybe heard, about Fritz Perls, he could have been a bit like gruff, very straightforward. And for the second class, I have you all watch the Gloria session. If you're not familiar with that, this person, I think it was in the 60s, did 3 psychotherapy sessions, one with Fritz Perls, one with Carl Rogers, and one with Albert Ellis. You're probably familiar with Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy, and Albert Ellis, rational emotive psychotherapy, the CBT world, from the CBT world, and then obviously Fritz Perls Gestalt. And it's a fascinating, still, I think, a fascinating session to watch. If you have the time, of course, watch all 3. But what was that? Where was I? Somatic based. So when you're watching Fritz Perls, he's very, very straightforward. And some of where Ron Kurtz took things is he made it more relational. I mentioned authentic relating earlier. If you look at even just that term, and absolutely a Gestalt practice, but they're able to hold both the authenticity piece and the relational piece in their name. Authentic, some people are really good at being very authentic, but maybe they struggle with being relational. So they come off, somewhat hurtful for many people. And then you have folks on the other end of the extreme that maybe are very good at relationality, but maybe struggle with being authentic. And that has its own benefits and drawbacks. What was nice with what Hakomi brought in, and again, cross-pollination, is more of a focus on being relational. And when you watch, if you haven't watched it yet, the Bob Resnick video, he speaks to that, how Gestalt has become more relational over the years. Let's call it more kind, more respectful, not such a focus, over focus, or exclusive focus on authenticity, but also recognizing that, well, I'll just leave it at that for now. There's a lot we could say about all this, but I want to try to make this a manageable time length. So okay, this is another distinction, important one. We'll get more to it later in the whole unit on development of self and development. But in psychoanalysis, self forms and then we do relationship, where in Gestalt, self forms in relationship. The sense of self isn't static, it's fluid and changes in each relationship. And with each person, we are different selves. And it starts in utero with our mothers and what happens there. This is according to Dewey. This I should have had in red. These are from notes I'm remembering that he had. Okay, so Gestalt therapy. Okay, this is big. Just thinking about time. I'm going to try to fit in the rest of this and then pause this video, and then we'll get into some of the more core concepts. I'm going to just scroll through this. So you can pause the video and take a look at it. But we're going to get to all of this. And first, we'll wrap up to somewhat defining Gestalt psychotherapy. So there is an issue with any theory that goes into judgment. This is Dewey, big thing. So Dewey, just to give that a little bit of context, Dewey does a lot of equine therapy, and he talks about how when you are with a horse, you can see where they brace, when they brace. And there's a couple specific things that will trigger a brace in the horse, meaning they see you as a threat. One is by your stress. If you're anxious, if you're stressed, they'll pick up on that and you'll see them brace. You will no longer be a safe object in their environment, safe stimuli in their environment, how you present. And then the other one, very, very interesting, is judgments. If you're judging the horse, that registers for them as predator. And Dewey talks about how that's in most circles how we mainly prey on each other is through our judgments. So that is why it's so valuable that this approach has as part of its core a holistic relationship to somebody's growth and development and how they present. Because if you are sitting across from someone, judging them, then even with DSM diagnoses, even clinical, that can come across as a judgment, and then we've become predator, and then there's a break in the contact. We don't make contact with predators. We judge them as such, and then they become an object through our judgments. Yeah. So keep that in mind. We're going to talk more about the horses and the bracing later in one of the core concepts. But just in the spirit of wrapping up this first piece around what is Gestalt psychotherapy, let's talk about some of the more transpersonal pieces. So non-dual versus theistic relational. This is speaking to, this would have been spacing the book, but a book you maybe hopefully read from in the transpersonal psychotherapy class or psychology class. But he talks about, I'm spacing it, but he talks about that if you look at the spiritual traditions, you can lump many of them into two categories. The ones that at the absolute level see quote unquote reality as non-dual. Space, there's nothing actually there. Everything falls away. You can see how that then can have influences around ideas around impermanence, but at the absolute level, there's nothing. It's non-dual. Versus the traditions where it's theistic relational, meaning at the absolute level, there is someone, entity, consciousness there to have a relationship. Maybe the most common name for that for many people is God. Could be more than one gods. could just be energy, all that is, but it has a consciousness to be in relationship with. That is just quite different from there's just nothing there. So transpersonal Gestalt traditionally, Pearls, from my understanding, talking to Deb, was atheist agnostic. And I would argue with his draw towards Zen Buddhism and Taoism, probably related to the absolute level as non-dual, where with the transpersonal Gestalt, there is an opportunity to relate to consciousness in a way that assumes, experiences, maybe even honors that it's not, it doesn't unravel at the end of the day into nothingness and darkness, but there's something there having an experience, and that continues in some form or fashion. So that's just for context. I'm going to weave that into the rest of these pieces. And just checking the time. So working with energy, back to Dewey's piece. He does believe that people have energy, hold energy. And in terms of unfinished business is another way of looking at it, that with at least especially emotional energy, but obviously also sensations at times, we're looking at where is the hose kinked, and the disruption, the homeostasis disruption we're supporting is unkinking the hose, allowing the energy to move again. And we're going to get a lot more into that, working with the body, unfinished business. I think it's class 10. What are emotions, how to work with them safely. But is it maybe actual energy? And just not to give too much away, but just plant some seeds here. What if energy is natural? What if energy knows where to move, how to move? What if energy self-organizes? And the problems come in when our minds or our egos, whatever you want to call that aspect of self, comes in and tries to control. Later, we're going to get into multiplicity of personality, parts, and Gestalt. The term is top dog, underdog. Freud talked about superego, ego, id. A lot of models talk about a type of typology for the psyche. But you can see where the psyche starts to get into a war with itself. A war over what? A war over experience, experiencing the energy, allowing the energy to move. Okay, moving right along, really only because of time. Transpersonal, here and now, is inherently transpersonal per the various mindfulness practices and traditions. And this ties more to the non-dual traditions. If there really isn't anything there to connect with, which is fine, it's a possibility. Something very, very powerful about letting it all go and just being in the moment and experiencing just the here and now. Naranjo Claudio, one of your texts, he goes into this more in depth. There's a whole chapter on Gestalt as a transpersonal practice. But if we're thinking more theistic relational, then what if all this energy actually has a consciousness? So that in I, thou, we, I've said I, thou up to now, but Dewey talks about I, thou, we. It's not just I and thou, but we also create a we. But that even the we create might have its own consciousness. In essence, what's the term? Not sentient. I'm spacing it. Sentient. I think sentient being is something I learned in Buddhism at during my Naropa studies. I think it's sentient being, and I would argue, and had a lot of experiences with this, that even just thought forms can have their own consciousness. And this gets to this idea that all energy has consciousness. Maybe it's beyond energy. But let's say, for example, you have a book project, you've been thinking about it for years. What if it was possible to tap into the energy, the thought forms of that book project and have a relationship with it and even receive guidance from it? What if that was possible? Of course, maybe more non-dual and or theistic relation or agnostic atheist types might say, "I'm just making all that up." Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. At the end of the day, you just open to what you're open to and you trust your experience. So all that to say, some Gestalt folks, Dewey included, would say that when we're doing parts work, little foreshadowing if you're not familiar with parts work's role in Gestalt, it's got a big one. But these parts we're working with, it's just a way to represent internal experiences, thoughts, feelings, sensations. But in a sense, it's kind of just kind of an object. Or are these parts actual, there's the term, sentient beings, as they would propose in internal family systems, where it has a deep, deep respect for parts and treating them respectfully, welcoming them, and supporting all parts' growth and development, in part because they are quote unquote real. Is something to consider and to be curious about. You may already have your, kind of preconceptions from your spiritual practices or your life experience, but you want to be aware that both of these worlds are out there, of course, because you're going to have clients that fall into either camp, and you got to be able to meet them where they're at, respect their experience, their philosophy, how they see the world. And I would argue your theory guides your intervention. That's from Ross Greene. We're going to get more into him later. At least be open to both theories so that you can take advantage of how that person holds it and what is then possible. Gosh, there's so much to say about that, but I want to leave it at that, mainly just for time's sake. Okay, so last thing I'll read, and then we'll pause this lecture. As we go through the rest of these basic Gestalt concepts in the first 2 weeks of class, the first 2 weeks classes, and really for the rest of the semester, see them as parts of how we define transpersonal Gestalt, and gradually by the end of the semester, understanding what transpersonal Gestalt will feel like a complete Gestalt. There's a lot of information in this first semester. Good news is we're trying to get it all out of the way first semester, the bulk of the reading first semester, so you have it all, and then we just run with it second semester. But there is a lot, just be open to it, like different puzzle pieces. And then trust me that eventually or at some point, it's going to start to come together as a whole. And of course, let me know what questions you might have, and bring those to class, and we'll have plenty of time in class to discuss them. Okay, so thank you for your attention and focus. I know this is a lot of information. Grateful that you can pause these videos as you need to, and we'll get you the next videos as soon as possible. Thank you. Oh, and per our tradition at Naropa, let's go ahead and bow out to mark the end of our time together if you'd like to join me.